Thank you very much, Andre. And I'm Jane Marie Souza, Associate Provost at the University of Rochester, and have had the pleasure and privilege of serving as the AALHE President in this past year. And now it is my honor to introduce someone who truly does probably not need an introduction. I think she's reached that status where she could go by one name, Natasha, right? Just Natasha. But Dr. Natasha Jankowski serves as the Executive Director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, affectionately known as NILOA. She is also a Research Associate Professor in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is co-author with her NILOA colleagues of the book, Using Evidence of Student Learning to Improve Higher Education, as well as co-author of Degrees That Matter, Moving Higher Education to a Learning Systems Paradigm. She works in partnership with her NILOA colleagues and others in the field on assignment design, transparency, evidence-based storytelling, equity, mapping and alignment of learning, and all things assessment. NILOA is the proud recipient of ACPA Contribution to Higher Education Award, and Natasha is the recipient of the Academic Professional Excellence Award from the University of Illinois. She received the Kent State University Alumni Award and the Young Alumni Award from the College of Education at UIUC. Sorry about that. She holds a PhD in higher education from the University of Illinois, a Master of Arts in Higher Education Administration from Kent State University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Illinois State University. And of course, you probably know her best for her energy level, what puts that little pink bunny to shame. With that, I turn it over to Natasha, and thank you so much for being our keynote today.
Thank you, Jane Marie, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone to week 2 of AALHE and the keynote conversation for today. I'm honored and delighted to virtually be with you, and it's a bit odd for me to not be able to see everyone, so I will still talk with my hands, and you're in my hearts. And I know that you may be looking at my title right now and going, wait a minute, weren't you supposed to be doing a talk on looking back to move forward, building towards equitable assessment, thinking over the last 10 years of equity and assessment work and our growth to this point and where we need to go? And yes, that's true, and I will, but it's 2020. And I know I normally speak to sort of reassure and get us thinking deeply about our work, which I still do. But today I want to stir a pot, and I want to trouble some conceptions. And I want us to think honestly and deeply about an equity and assessment issue. And I cannot engage in thinking about where we are and where we need to go without reflecting on equity in interesting times, which is actually not a phrase. It's not a Chinese phrase that's a curse. It's a British one about living in an interesting age. If anybody wants to go down that rabbit hole, we can do that. So first off, I would like to say welcome. And I want to give a great shout out to Dr. Arbuthnot for her keynote last week on thinking about the item level differences on the tests in the high context culture versus the low context culture, and her importance and the focus on feedback and transparency and modeling for our learners and thinking about instructions and test fairness. And it was a really great in-depth conversation into the research that was there. And it was also a good reminder that it is important to remember that the students that come to us have experiences with assessment from somewhere else, whether it may have been K-12, whether it may have been work, wherever that might be. And all the tests and those sort of standardized experiences that Dr. Arbuthnot was sharing about, we need to remember that we cannot negate that experience, that does not go away when our students come with that to how they're thinking about assessment. So what are we doing today if we think about sort of where she set us up and the conversations that have been going all last week? And I really wanted to do a talk that's designed for AALHE audiences because you're the assessment folks. And so I'm going to start from an assumption that we can start here and take it to another level and sort of like, let's think about what this is. I want to start more advanced and get us moving in that direction. This is also, though, a presentation of some ideas that are not fully formed. So I apologize, but this will be an exploratory journey of my thinking on where we are in assessment in 2020, where we currently are, and where we need to go. Hence the children's book of what are we even doing with our lives, which if you have not checked out, I think you should. But I'm glad to have you with me on this journey. And this may or may not work, but this is assessment, so we're going to do it and see how it goes. So let's get into it. For those not familiar, I got to do my super quick shout out. We have a website. It's amazing. It's learningoutcomesassessment.org. Anything that I talk about resource-wise, you can find on there. Everything's free and open. And we as an organization are a research and resource development group looking nationally at how colleges and universities go about assessing student learning. Specific to COVID-19 resources, if anyone's looking for something along that, there is the great Slack channel that AALHE is running and houses. There's also a Google Doc on our landing page. There's a recorded webinar series that you can find from the links there. And if you haven't taken it yet, we do have a survey that is out. There's still time. We are going to close it pretty quick, and there'll be a report on the findings from the survey that will come out in our July newsletter. So if you haven't, take a moment to complete that short survey. So there's my important NILOA things out of the way. But today, I want to tell you a little bit about me and why I want to go down this rabbit hole that we're going to go down together on equity and assessment and thinking about that work. So I have a background originally in undergraduate in continental philosophy. So specific sort of background in philosophy, very Western philosophy approach. I also minored in archaeology, and my sort of idea behind that was that if I got into a place in philosophy where I was writing some fulsome treatise and I was going insane, I would leave and I would go play in the dirt. And I actually had the distinct pleasure of working on an archaeological dig in the Roman forums. And there's something very soothing about writing an incredibly neat little penmanship on bits of broken pottery, the quadrant from which it came. It was a wonderful experience to get me prepared for data analysis and cleaning on a large scale in that way. But the salient point is that the application of critical thought immersed in something that we do every day is key. We are so action oriented and so much doing and responding, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes it harder for us to pause and reflect and look at these little pieces. A piece of broken pottery is to be put together somehow to make a whole. And a lot of times we spend time taking an element and looking at it and not thinking about how these all fit together based off of inferences we make about relationships and relational imageries. So the first conference that I ever went to as an undergrad was a philosophy conference in Oregon. It's the first time I'd ever done one. I didn't know how you do conferences. I had no understanding of it. We had a faculty member that drove a van from Illinois State University to Oregon. There was 5 of us in there, and I gave this paper that was titled Racism as a Terrorist Institution, where I used Kant and a feminist philosopher who talks about terrorism to juxtapose these conceptions. And I ran into the keynoter who was talking, and I thought he was amazing. I had his book, and I went up to him to have him sign it as an undergrad. I was like, this is going to be so great. And all I said is that I love your brain. And then I ran away, like straight up ran away. But I've been thinking a lot about that paper lately and why I liked that philosopher. So that's the setup for where we get into equity and assessment and why I want to go about talking through this with you this way today. So if we think about what are those pieces that we can put together to paint a picture and make a full pot, where can we reflect on equity and assessment? Or where can we just reflect on equity in assessment? And really it's throughout. We can think about the process that's implemented throughout the institution. We can think about how we implement that process, how we go about following those guidelines. We can think about the policies that are in support or put around it. We can think about the methods that we use, how we analyze our data, how we go about making our decisions on what to do on it, and then the subsequent actions that we take on it, which I think then says, we've started this conversation, we've gotten to a place, what would assessment look like if it really was a vehicle for equity? And that's where I want to start our piece. Now, this is not to say that people aren't doing this already and that we haven't been thinking about these conversations. We currently have a call out right now in partnership with CAS and Campus Labs for an edited volume we're doing on equity and assessment to share examples. So if you have an example of something that you're doing, share. Please do feel free to be a part of that. We are also, I'm pleased to announce this week, releasing our case studies on equity and assessment, the first 3 in a series, and we're still accepting more examples of that. So if you have something, reach out and share. We did 2 occasional papers on the topic, and we invited people to respond, and we're still taking invitations to respond. So you can always be a part of the conversation in that way. AALHE had 2 intersections focused on this topic. There are conferences with tracks on equity, much like there's a track on equity here. And I'm honored as well that we have a partnership with HBCU CEQA, and I'm excited about their forthcoming special issue of assessment update. So this is not to say that we aren't thinking about this work, we aren't doing this work, that there aren't examples of this work. We're not starting from a ground zero, but we do have some hard truths that we need to think about and talk through. So I'd like to start with the work of the equity scorecard. And if you're not familiar, there's a link in here that you can go take a look. And there's a great book that provides sort of the theory of change behind it and the website around it. But Estella Ben-Simon, in thinking about the equity scorecard, makes this point about how we interact with data. And she writes that practitioners and scholars respond to the evidence of a lack of something. We don't have students graduating. We don't have students learning. We don't have enough of our students learning at a particular level. And the response is to ask questions of what is wrong with those students. So we start with, do these students try hard enough? Are they really putting their most effort forward? How do they compare with another group of students? Are these students academically integrated? Are they engaged? Are they motivated? Are they involved? And what more do those students need to do to succeed? So we look at a student and then we wonder what's wrong with that student and how can we get that student to do more things that look right, okay? So what that does actually is start to reflect and develop norms of what a good student is, how a good student learns, how a good student demonstrates their learning and shows it in that regard. And those norms of good students are generally built off of our traditional aged college student, full-time, our model student that knows how to navigate an institution and understands what it means to be a student. And then there are those who don't act like them, who aren't involved as much, who don't engage, and are otherwise labeled in some deficit manner as at risk or disadvantaged and the like. In philosophy, this would be the equivalent of critiquing someone for not being the Platonic form, which if you understand anything about Platonic forms, it's not how that works. Basically, what it does though is say, you student need to be more like this student, assimilation in that regard, to be successful in here. So the focus then, historically in engaging with equity conversations, they argue from their work, is on looking at the students and what's wrong with the students. Now, if we work off of that model, and part of the equity scorecard work is to say, what's the institution? What are the structures? This is not a student's fault. What are we doing in this larger space? Is to think about whose voice is heard. And when we're looking at assessment data and learning data, questions of whose voice is heard are incredibly important in this regard. It's one of the reasons why we are huge advocates for student voice, thinking about storytelling and in all of these pieces. So if we work off the model of an ideal student, then we can sometimes lead to stories that I tell, like if you've ever heard me tell the story of the bus where students were showing up late, faculty members said, I can't teach students that aren't motivated to be here and don't want to learn. And it was that the city bus schedule had changed and students were taking the bus. And so they were coming, they were motivated, they're working it out. But the defeatist approach to, there's nothing I can change in my practice because this is already, it's fatalistic, it's already been decided. is not something that is helpful to us in examining our data. There's no need to look deeper. It's inevitable that it would be that way. And then you get into sort of a lack of root cause analysis of what's really going on here. How do we need to deeper engage with our data and information? And you start to hear things like, well, college isn't for everyone anyway. Some people make it through, some people don't, you know, they just got to try harder. Or you need to be more like another student. Why don't you do these types of behavior things to get into it? So that ideal model really theorizes about assumptions we have of our students regarding what we need to change if our students are not learning. So if our students are not learning, what do they need to succeed? Now, we can do a lot of things, and we sometimes offer supports. We engage in all sorts of problem solutions, but it's done on behalf of our students as though they are not experts of their own experience, as though we know what they need to be successful, which is an issue because then it allows us to perpetuate norms without any kind of examination in that regard. So the equity scorecard theory of change, Stella Ben-Simone's group, is about focusing on the students that you have, not the ones that you wish you had, not the ones that you think you have, but the students that you actually have, and then making sense of those racial patterns of inequity that are revealed within our own institutional data. So it's looking at our data as an institution and saying, what's going on here in this regard? And she talks about this as looking at racialized outcomes or rationalized outcomes. And the concept of rationalized outcomes is an incredibly fascinating thing, where we rationalize why we would see some students doing particular things. The example that she gives in the book is of Latino students that, of course, less Latino students would transfer to the flagship institution farther away because they prefer to stay close to home. There's no need to ask them about it. We know what that is. That's, you know, based on that. So most of that comes from that we don't, they argue, have the funds of knowledge to assist us in noticing patterns of racial inequity. We rationalize it away. There's no need to look deeper because we've already figured out what that's about. Problem solved. So we don't need to get to the root cause of what's going on there. So we can't analyze them in relation to failures of structures, policies, or practices that we can actually change. So I say to you, as part of this talk, we cannot afford to allow this to continue. We have to see these things. So how do we see these things? How do we engage with that? Well, we can ask ourselves some questions. And some of these are very similar questions to things that we have put out elsewhere to really help us interrogate our own practice. Like, how is learning examination done here? What are we really looking at in our processes and our practices? In what ways are those processes and practices failing a particular student group? So we're actually looking for that. We're asking that question and diving in. And in what ways are my practices or the practices of this institution related to racial inequities in those outcomes? As Ben-Simone argues in sort of a question process they use in the scorecard, in what ways are our institutional practices enabling or reinforcing our racial inequities and outcomes? And we talk about that a lot in graduation gaps. We don't talk about it as much in learning gaps outside of standardized tests conversations, which means this is not enough for us to sort of adopt best practices, to say, without critical examination of our existing internal processes. This could be an us issue, not something that we can band-aid with something that works for someone else. So involving students, which is something that we talk about, and asking them about their learning is a great place to start. But it is not enough because we are also dealing with that lived experience and history of our students that we do not have trust with our students and those to whom we need to know their experience to share it with us. They have no assurance that their voice will be heard this time or that any change will happen. And so how do we get around that? So we can go and say, students, tell us. But if students like, oh, what do you want to hear sort of situation, or I'm not comfortable to tell you because it's never mattered before, then we have an issue. So I want to point to Beverly Daniel Tatum, past president of Spelman College, who starts her book why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, with defining terms to get very clear on language, which is always a great thing in assessment for us to know what we're talking about. So she writes, stereotypes, omissions, and distortions all contribute to the development of prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information. I assume that we all have prejudices, not because we want them, but simply because we are so continually exposed to misinformation about others. We never stop to check. We hear a lot of things, it's ingested all the time. What do we do with that? She goes on to state in the book that we need to, each of us, take responsibility. We need to look at our behaviors and ask if we are perpetuating or are we seeking to challenge. And I think one of the questions we can ask ourselves as assessment professionals doing this work is, what type of student, if we think back to those norms that relate to if it's a problem, for us to even engage in a change process around, what type of student does our assessment processes and discourses privilege? Are there particular types of learners or ways of learning that are elevated over others? Now, one way to check for that people have been doing is to disaggregate data. And I just love these little pigeons. This is one of those things that's for me. And because he's wearing like the breadcrumb, I don't know. But if we think about disaggregating data, it's a great place to start, but it's not enough in itself. We can divide up the data, we can slice and dice, we can do all of these things, but we have to ask hard questions of the data. And we need to be able to sit with it. I appreciate the SAR's point of break down, take down, dismantle. It's not just, look at bits of it, but it's more of that action piece. There's an action-oriented relational activity in there. Harrison and Price frame this as not seeing data as entrenched, but changeable. So in essence, we must do something. We have to do something. Something must be done. So the act of disaggregating data is a forethought, that's a foreground process to then the going into taking action. Now, if we just talked though about norms and all of these other things and prejudices that are implicit in our work, we need to take action with caution. So action changes things, but we don't want to make it worse. We don't want to reinforce stereotypes and engage in that process. So we need to do this with caution and grace. I want to go back to Beverly Tatum, who says that we have a responsibility to interrupt the cycle. In assessment, this means that we need to dig deeper when someone says what it is they want to do, that it's not enough for us to track how did you use this, but we need to look at why are you changing these things? Why do you think that will lead to that learning improvement that our scholar friends want to see? And how do we ensure that the what to do part, that decisions we make on what we're going to change aren't based on assumptions that we have about the other or about our students, but it's actually right for our students, the students that we have that are part of this educational journey with us. Again, it's going to be hard to figure out when we have a trust situation for students of color who have no reason to expect that their voices will be heard, specifically within predominantly white institutions. There's a longstanding history of not allowing voices of our student organizations and groups to be heard at the level that they are interested until an incident occurs, and then we immediately turn to them going, hey, come over here and tell us about this. We also do the same thing within our assessment processes with our tenured faculty who make decisions for our program, or if you have one faculty member who is the program who makes decisions that's then implemented by our adjunct faculty, really thinking who has the expertise from which we need to engage to choose what to change and build. So thinking about, yes, action, but action with caution and action with deep reflection and thought is going to be very important, because we do not want to use data to justify harm, and we do not want to reinforce false narratives about our students and about their learning. So the point here is that we can disaggregate data and we can talk about it and we can sit with it. But we need to catch ourselves and we need others to catch us, and we need to be open to that conversation when someone says, you didn't ask to double check the data when the white students were succeeding. It was assumed they would be successful. But when we saw that our Black students were succeeding, you had me run it 3 times to check, because that can't possibly be right. What's going on there? We need to have those hard conversations in that space. If our white students aren't succeeding, the conversation is, what is the school doing wrong? What is our institution doing wrong? If it is our students of color, what's wrong with these students? And how are these students not engaging in that? So as assessment professionals in these conversations, we have to catch it, we have to call it, and we have to talk about it. That requires vulnerability and strength, but we're the people that knock on doors and say, where are you with this? And they close the doors in our face. So if we can't have the hard conversations already, then I don't know who will. Bazile, who I really enjoy in narrative understandings of ontology, so who the other is, talks about posing standards of fairness that are based on the ability of one or few of disenfranchised students to succeed. So that concept of, well, 2 of them did it, why can't everyone else, right? We can't all be a Bill Gates, but we need to be watchful for the systemic inequalities that go unseen. So part of our engagement with any kind of data needs to be making that seen, making it visible, I would argue. Which means we need to think about that use process, which is, we know, the hardest part in our assessment loop. So we have issues with that conceptualization, but when you get to that end and you say use, there's a whole process that's cognitive that goes on in there that needs to be unpacked. I'm gonna pause for another talk later. We can go down like a rabbit hole of objectivity and rationality and how that gets us to where we are. And I'm super happy to virtually do that with you over a cup of coffee. But we don't have enough time for that today. So I will simply have to say that I am in alignment with Bianca Williams, who claims, and all of these folks are in the reference list that I added to the end of these slides, so you'll have them if you want to read them, that she does not believe in the fiction of objectivity. I believe that the experiences we have, the identities we embody, and the positions we hold in systems of power impact how we see and navigate the world. And I think that's true for some in-depth philosophical reasons we won't need to go into. But so instead I say, let's start here. Let's start with Ben-Simone's quote on this slide that says, conventional perspectives center on change as an outcome of rational actions that have been induced through strategic planning, data-based decision-making, external accountability systems, instrumental incentives, restructuring, or adoption of best practices. Inherent in that quote is the myth of the rational mind, which is how Bazile talks about it, which is a construct of Western European Enlightenment conceptions of knowledge and rationality, devoid of emotion. It's done to create boundaries and do all these really interesting things. And one could actually argue that learning outcomes are an attempt to rationalize and control the inherently messy process of learning. It's a tension between art and science, and the elegance is in design, we could say. You could. I like to side on the thing of thinking about assessment is presenting a well-reasoned argument on why we think doing the things that we do matter, and thinking intentionally about the evidence we use to support those arguments in those ways. So the equity question that's within that data use process is who gets to decide which pieces count, when, and how much. So if we're making arguments and we're saying, oh, this is enough students for me to act, who's making that decision, and how does that decision get made? There is a piece to this about avoiding invisibility. So under the guise of objectivity and rationality and sort of this search for truth that comes from this Enlightenment process, small n's, statistical significance, are served to marginalize, maybe is a way that I can say it. So it becomes well, there's not enough of these students for us to put in here. So those students are just gone. Where did those students go? They become invisible. There's a great piece by the American Indian College Fund on creating visibility, because Native American students are consistently asterisks that aren't in the data set. They're not there. They're like, oh, you can even have all of the tribal colleges, every single one of them participate in something. People are like, they're over there. They become invisible to the conversation as a data point, as something to even track longitudinally. So I would say, what are we trying to prove? Are we guided in assessment by principles of empiricism in science and these kinds of things? Or are we guided by evidentiary processes to make decisions where if we have a program of 5 students and 2 of them didn't make it, we care because of a program of 5, 2's a lot. And let's take a look at what's going on with those 2. Or if we've got, because there's students that are here, we should look at what's going on and think about it. If it's a measurement issue, if it's about how do we handle small n's, it is not an equity consideration. It's an issue of measurement. So how do we have conversations about data that are equity issues to say, we can leave these measurement issues aside, and that's something we can talk about for research purposes, but for equity considerations for us and our institutions, do we have an ethical obligation to look and to talk and to really think it through? So Solorzano and Yoso talk about counter storytelling, which I think is super cool. I like storytelling in all its forms. And there's a quote that I like about this concept, which is, a critical race theory challenges the traditional claims that educational institutions, make toward objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity. Racism is disguised in the rhetoric of shared normative values and neutral social, scientific, and educational principles and practices. It's not that I choose not to, it's that I can't by following the principles of science. So something to consider as we think about our work, how that all fits together and in what ways. So where do we get now? That's a lot. There's a bunch of different concepts and things that were covered in that. Where do we end up in our thinking? I would like to offer you some foundational sort of assumptions of where we get, and then some questions to think about to look at our practice. So the first is, if we do equity work in assessment, then assessment is positioned immediately outside of a compliance box. It's not about compliance. We don't even have to have that sort of conversation about Tencent. The equity focus on assessment is inherently and necessarily different from that. So that's sort of a foundational assumption 1. You do not have to agree with these. I am proposing these from where we sort of got in our thinking. The second one that I would posit is that higher education as an enterprise is socially constructed. What do I mean by that? So I take this from a way that Harrison and Price talks about it, which is higher ed, as we know today, has evolved over time. The status quo thing is short-lived. There's a lot of shift and movement and all of that. What it means is that somebody at some point made a decision to do it in a particular way, which means that we can choose to do it differently. We have a choice. If you want to get into free will, we can do that. But the point is thinking about what choices are we making? When do we choose to act? And when do we choose to say, oh no, that's always been this way, we're not going to change in that regard. It's a social construction, which means we are part of a social compact, which means we are agreeing to things and we're agreeing to behave in particular ways. So throw that out there as a assumption from which we can think about building equity and assessment work and practice. The third one is that everyone is going to have limiting higher education narratives. And by that, I mean narratives that hinder our ability to make changes because of how we see and how we understand. This goes back to the conversation on built-in assumptions, norms, prejudices. It takes time to dismantle and engage with that. Because of that, there are certain ways that we think students can be successful, where and in what ways and what needs to be done. What that means then is we need to be mindful of that, and we need to put in checks and balances to engage in that process. One check and balance to get into that I would offer is from Harrison and Price, who I had mentioned on the story part, that says, go through your own narrative story of success in higher education. So sit down with your cup of tea, and get yourself a cookie. These are things that you need cookies and chocolate for, and ask yourself, what was my higher education access and success story? What did that story entail? And not the one that I tell others maybe, but the one that I tell myself, the one that's real about how you moved through and engaged in that. And then ask, how likely was I to earn a bachelor's degree? What and why? What was going on with that? How does that engage? Now, for us, we're all sitting here, products of graduate school. I think most everyone, if you're not, that's cool. I still appreciate you. Reflect on your graduate school access and success story and think about how accessible was graduate school to you. So you're still thinking about that part. And then what does all of that reveal about your higher education narrative? What does it also conceal? What does that mean that there are things that you cannot see because you never experienced, because you don't know, because it wasn't your life journey? So that's a good exercise to sort of start that internal process of self-reflection, to think about and engaging in then, okay, where do I know that I need checks and balances as I engage in assessment work on learning, and sort of where do I have predisposed dispositions to some sorts of things, and go in that regard. So fun exercise when you're in quarantine, go through and do your narrative story, and then check back in. We'll see how you are. I do want to offer a few more assumptions. So we had that if we're doing equity work, it's not compliance driven. It's inherently a horse of another color, let's say. That higher education is socially constructed, which means that we made things, we can unmake things. And the third one that we talked about from before was that we all have narratives which guide our views and limit what we see. So those are the three assumptions from before. I want to add to that the assumption, foundational sort of agreement point, that most of our standardized measures in theories come from studies of white students in mostly white institutions. So it indicates a lot of times the benefits of certain types of learning, certain types of things to students. There was a great example of this conversation if you were at the Association for the Study of Higher Education last year. Glenn Phillips and Sonia Jones presented from HBCU CEQA members as well, on culture surveys and climate culture. That climate culture surveys, the theories that they were based on were really about white comfort in diversity, and not about marginalized students or students of color feeling in their campus culture and their climate. Really great, I think, to take a look at. So it says we cannot be protected by pointing to theory. We need to necessarily interrogate the theory, and we need to interrogate the theory behind measures that we use to see if we are reinforcing and supporting and engaging in things that we do not condone and do not want to be a part of. Another one is we value certain demonstrations of learning over others, and in this way, we limit speech. We privilege quantitative data. It cuts out voice. It does not allow us to get into explorations of why or how certain things unfold. Kashino talks about this as silencing, the silencing process of dashboards, data dashboards in this regard. Some of this is about, well, we want that objectivity. This is why we need to have a longer conversation on that. But what are we really trying to do in assessment? Is it decision making? Are we trying to prove learning? Are we trying to make a coherent argument based on inferences from different types of learning that we see? Are we trying to engage in a research enterprise? Depending on what it is that we're doing, some of these things become more salient than others. But I think understanding that our goal in this space should maybe be acting ethically towards our students and our learners might be a good place to start. The another one that I would point to on here, well, with the value of certain demonstrations of learning over others is also connected to this valuing narrative. We do not value narrative or personal experience in the same way for institutional decision making as we do for quantitative data. When we limit speech, we cut out things like photo, music, quilt making to paint pictures. We cut out oral traditions. We cut out expression in a lot of different ways. We have default when we were doing our assignment designs, when somebody was doing writing, they were doing academic writing of a research paper. There's a very particular type of writing of one kind. It filters out other types of writing by honing in on that one. In Italy, you can look at the viva voce, which is the oral discussion as peers around a topic. That's an assessment mechanism. But that concept of as peers, I do not think we have in our assessment process here. It's not you have to justify yourself to me, lay bare your learning, exposed to me such that I can judge. But I digress. Anyway, so we value certain things, which means we limit what we see. And then we don't really value narrative or personal experience in this regard, which leads me to sort of my last point that I think we really need to all agree upon as a community, which is our students are experts of their own experience. We just need to lock that in as like a final answer on a win $1 million question. Our students are the experts of their own experience. The amount of times I have heard in conversations of, no, you don't mean that. When a student literally just said what they mean is a bit obscene. So thinking about, we need to understand that our students exist in context. There are social, there are power dynamics. These are all things that we know. And how we get to cultural competency, it means that we actually have to hear what our students are saying. So when we get to that part mentioned prior about lack of trust on our students' point in telling us what's going on with them, when they have shared, we don't listen, or worse yet, when they do share, we shut down and get upset, and now they have to switch to comfort. And that is not a healthy relationship between a student and institution. So how do we tackle these things? What do we do with these assumptions? I offer you questions. These are adapted from several of the authors, mostly heavily on this one from Ben Simone that we've talked about so far, to think about how do we have some hard talks and what questions can we ask to guide ourselves in that process, which is how ought we do assessment to be responsive to minority students? Like, how should we go about assessment that's responsive in that way? That's coming out in some of the equity and assessment work for sure. But are we asking ourselves that in our daily practice? So it's not just a scholarly exercise, but a lived one as well. How do we think about our responsibility as an institution, as practitioners, for the minority student outcomes that we see? How do we think about equity? How do we know who benefits from things that we really enjoy and are excited of? And how do the assumptions we make about our students advantage or disadvantage them? How do best practices take race and equity into account? Those are all questions that come from that equity scorecard work, modified a couple in some ways, to help institutions, practitioners within institutions, really start to think through and train themselves to see data differently, to see things in the data differently. Now, we also need to have some specific hard talks when we get into some of that data disaggregation. So Ben Simone offers some examples from different conversations that have happened in there, which is, let's just have the honest conversation on why are our practices failing to assist our African-American students? And that is a question that owns, and a question that also implies that we have to ask. So we need to engage in those broader, but also some very specific types of questions. And then also with that narrative story of where do I have lenses and how do these play, thinking about in what ways might my practices contribute to the formation of inequity in educational outcomes for Latinx. Or the point is, we're targeting in on a specific student population to say, what are we doing? Let us look at them. Let's not make this invisible. Let's make it very visible and a part of our conversation. And then in what ways do I use my resources, including power, authority, knowledge, and social networks on behalf of minoritized student populations, which are important questions for all of us to engage in. So you will have these slides if you want to take any of these questions and use any of them or modify them however you like for your own practice. So in assessment, sort of where have we gotten now in our journey through this discussion? We need to ask ourselves, what are our majority stories that are perpetuated in this space? And when do we sort of use assessment not to support but to silence? Are we being good and ethical stewards of student stories? With that, I would add a word of caution on guilt. Harrison and Price say when we get into these hard conversations and we start to engage in these processes and practices, and white people, I'm talking to you right now, it is emotionally difficult to claim social closure as part of our individual narratives. It is certainly not comfortable to acknowledge participation in social closure behaviors. And rather than acknowledge our participation, we often cling to defensiveness and rationalizations because we feel guilt. Guilt is a strong human emotion. It's important to consider because narratives are a way of structuring our perceptions of an issue in a way that lessens our guilt. So what do you need to do? You got to push through. This doesn't mean you're a bad person. The question isn't, do you feel bad? The question is, what is being done to interrupt the racism? Think about this like a runner, right? You hit that runner wall. You don't stop at the wall and feel bad for yourself that you ran into a wall. You push through the wall because the point is running a marathon. You're getting to the other side. You got to keep running. Run on through it. You're the one that pushes through it. And please do not turn to your minoritized students of color and be like, hey, help me pull me through this wall, because now you not only have to educate me, but you have to comfort me. And that is not what we should be doing. So get comfortable with being uncomfortable and push through. Marathon runner. Bring granola bars and snacks and things like that. Carb heavy. So this is a picture of past president of Spelman College, Beverly Tatum, we've talked about prior. And she talks about white privilege, saying, to whom much is given, much is required. I'd like to say that this sounds very similar to Spider-Man, which is akin with great power comes great responsibility, which is something that we have talked about with assessment professionals before, is that if we have these things, we need to engage with it. This takes vulnerability. Use your white privilege. It doesn't run out. It's not like you deplete it and it goes away. Otherwise, our students are invisible. Hard questions are not asked. Choices are made that can potentially harm instead of help enable and advance our learning. And with that, I want to end on a conversation note very quickly, and I'm sorry, I'm aware of our time, about mattering. So Daryl Smith uses Schlossberg to discuss mattering, which takes into account 4 qualities. One is attention, which is that you are noticed. Sorry, I was upset about this earlier today, and I'm gonna like calm down so I can get through this for you with you all here. That your presence or your absence is noticed, okay? The second one is that your failure or your success matters to others. So you can read. The third is that there's dependence, which is that the group that you are in depends upon you, that there's a sense of a group first and foremost in that space. You can think about this as an athletic team, if that's helpful in that regard. And the last is appreciation, that mattering is manifest, that it's not, oh, I'm surprised that you're still here on campus. I didn't think you'd make it. Conversations when you run into a student later. But that instead, it's not the purview of an office to handle and address something. It's everyone's responsibility within an institution to show up and show out for our students and be there in part of this regard. As our students start to share their learning journey and listen, every time that we don't hear them, every time that we say a student's voice doesn't matter, every time that we say a learning demonstration doesn't count, we fail to do what Schlossberg indicates on mattering. We tell a student with our words and our actions and our metrics and our measures that they do not matter. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when it comes to things like Black Lives Matter, because those 4 quality points from Schlossberg aren't there. We haven't shown them that. So if we go through all of these sorts of pieces that we've been thinking about, and where are we with equity assessment and where do we need to go, I would posit that we need new theories. We need new theories to understand the margins, that we need not only the equity and assessment conversations and our social justice conversations and our decolonizations, but we simply need to have honest conversations on anti-racist assessment and what that might look like, what that might entail, and how we can make these things very visible and forefront to our conversations in that place. So to put all this together in some short things you can remember, a way forward is show up. Show up with your full humanity, come with your critical eye, be ready to be an advocate and act, and engage in those hard discussions and questions that were presented prior. Use some of them, try them out, do your social journey and go on it. Be radically honest with yourself and others. Sincerity is spottable for our students. They can tell. And be real. Assessment is a place that diversity statements can come to life. They can be lived. These things can be real and not just something that goes on a wall that's put up as a poster. So show up, engage, be honest, get real about these things, and you're going to engage in that. I also know that I apologize, we did not really get into student affairs. If you want that, there is a webinar ACPA is doing with some colleagues on Wednesday. So join in, and then you have references if you want to do a deeper dive. But thank you for your time. Sorry to like cut us right up to the end there, but I will open for discussion and dialogue and all that good stuff.
Thanks, Natasha. That was so awesome. So I'm going to ask some questions that our members have posed. Here's one. But we use traditional demographic breakdowns when we disaggregate. How can we change the demographics that we look at when collecting data?
I think some of it is what questions we are trying to answer and what lens we get into. So there's a lot of disaggregation for disaggregation's sake based off of ways that things have been classified for some other purpose, whether it's external reporting that we need to collect that someone says, tell me how this breakdown is, or federal government, we want to know how many students of a particular type are participating in these kind of programs. So having a moment to look at what are the data definitions for student populations that we have and questions that we have in institution can help us sort of rethink some of those regards. So in some ways it's a pause on what you've got and a looking at it differently. So sort of it depends answer, but a good one to be thinking about and asking. Thank you for your question.
Great. How about, is there a class or workshop on equity and assessment offered anywhere?
There's a lot of conversations and a ton of resources and folks that are thinking about this in different ways. I mentioned some of the like different camps, like the scholarly camps that are going on this. Like there's a really good one on social justice assessment. There's conversations within the Association for Institutional Researchers on, they had a special issue on their new directions for institutional research on that topic and thinking about it. I would say a good place to start, of course I'm going to say it because it's our website, is go to our website and look under our work on the equity and assessment and some of those the conversation responses, and see if there's one that speaks to you more than another for where you are and where you want to go. And then the event calendar always has opportunities, but there are increasingly more and more ways to get involved and trainings and opportunities in that. But some of it is just take the time to read and catch up on where you fundamentally fit and think within this space.
Great. Here's another one. I would like to hear more about equity work, about how equity work sits outside of compliance. The new NWCCU standards reflect a focus on equity and outcomes in disaggregating data. How does that conflict with equity work?
Yes, so that, I will be brief in how I answer this. So there is one thing to require disaggregation of data, which is most of the things that we see, and we need to see some way in which, or you have processes by which you engage in disaggregation of data. Our point in most of this conversation was that data disaggregation on its own is not enough, that we need to interrogate it, we need to think about it, we need to look at it, we need to see what we don't see or what we choose not to see in the data and engage differently in that space. So the simple act of someone saying, hey, you must disaggregate data or have a process for it on that compliance piece. If we say we must disaggregate data because we aren't doing equity work, we're not going to interrogate that data and engage in it in that regard. The equity work of really rolling up our sleeves and getting into that data and talking with our students and going that additional step to interrogate our institutional processes and practices, that's the equity work that is not going to be required or something that's requested in that space. And so you'll still meet your data disaggregation process pieces or that you've done it, much like we have many state reporting requirements and federal requirements to report on certain student populations and numbers, but none of that touches any work in meaningful ways with equity. I hope that helps make sense of that.
I think so. So it's it's 2 o'clock right now, so we're at the end. If you have one thing that assessment practitioners can do in order to make equity work more a part of their day-to-day life, one recommendation for us, what would it be?
You know, honestly, it's the same thing that I think I say about every piece of assessment, which is proceed with confidence and believe that you can do it. The amount of times that we stop moving forward for no reason other than ourselves is impressive. And so I would say it's hard work. Somebody needs to do it. Why not us? We clearly care, or we wouldn't be in assessment and we wouldn't be thinking about students and their learning. So if this community can put their heads together, I think some really great things can happen.
All right. Thank you, Natasha. That was so great. And there are a number of different things going on today in the schedule, so please check out the schedule and we will see you more later this week. Okay, bye.